not a comparison you're expecting between a tree and God. But there was a story many years ago, and my meditation teacher told it to us, and it's always stuck with me. It was so simple, and it felt to my heart so profound. It just felt like dead truth. It was so obvious, yet I never would have thought of it. And I forget how the story actually went. But the idea is that a tree serves as a really beautiful example of how to live as a person. A tree does not care who steps underneath its branches. It will offer shade. That's what a tree does. I've always taken this at my own odd brain. I've always said this to myself. I'm like, Jeffrey Dahmer could go under a tree and receive shade all the same. There is no personality. There is no judgment. The nature of the tree is just to provide shade regardless who's coming beneath it. That's always stuck to me. That's always served in my mind as my ultimate example for how to live. It's not necessarily a reasonable or quick goal. Living in our ego is a huge part of why we're here. We're not supposed to dump our ego altogether. We are supposed to use it as a tool and learn through it and with it, honoring it, but having our heart and our spirituality in charge while doing that. So this tree story stuck with me for a bazillion years, probably like 15 years or more. Last summer, I had my near-death experience. It was so bizarre how being in God's presence brought me directly back to this story. Though it doesn't really surprise me considering how powerful that tree story seemed to me. I can't even remember the story. I can remember that tiny nugget to give to you. When I was in God's presence, I was aware that God exists, period, regardless as to who is in his presence. I hate the word is, but God simply is. It's hard to explain this, but being in his presence, and if you can imagine like a tea bag soaking in a mug of tea, that is viscerally how it was. I was in my astral body. I did not lose my personality. I was terrified the whole time, for example. But that is how completely I was within God's presence. And the purity of his presence made me absolutely sure that God is the full spectrum of sentience. He is both sentient and non-sentient. The purity of his presence, it's too pure to be anything but the entire spectrum of sentience. And that said, when I was in his presence, like one of the most profound things I realized being with God is that it utterly did not matter who I was. I was wild with fear. I was so afraid God wouldn't believe me for some reason that I just wanted help. I didn't want to die. I was given the choice. I wanted to make terribly clear I did not want to die. I was just looking for help, like cosmic AAA. Anyway, even through my wild fear, I was able to tell this. Even through that fear, I knew that it didn't matter who I was, that the blazing golden light I was received in, that impossibly pure love, if you want to call it love, that I was received in. God actually felt more like freedom to me than love, but being in that presence, I knew it did not matter who I was. I knew, while being terrified, thinking I had to convince God I wanted to stay, I knew, even through it all, I could have just murdered 10 people. And I would have been greeted the exact same way. God is. God simply exists. There are no conditions to his beingness. There is no judgment because there is no response. There is no reaction. God simply is God. Though I felt a kind of love that's impossible to put into words, it had nothing to do with what I was saying or what I had done in my human life or how I felt in that moment. There is no way I could have changed the frequency that God is. And that to me was the most profound relief ever. It meant that fear is untrue. What I knew in my astral bones, fear is untrue. It's a man-made thing. There is no judgment. Doesn't exist. God simply is. And we are extensions of that energy. That is why that story of the tree hit me so much. Because it was. I couldn't have known it. It was a perfect microcosmic metaphor of how God really is. So I hope either parts of that story stick with you like the tree story did with me probably 15 years ago. Because it makes it simple, which I always appreciate. Thank you so much. Thank you for liking and subscribing. Ladies, come visit me in Divining Women. All my love.